Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, setting the record straight about climate. Canada is locked in a deep freeze, and without fossil fuels, just about nobody would be living there. But the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation wants Canadians to believe they're burning up and that they will have to accept major life changes. CBC wants Canadians to give up fossil fuels, which are exactly what makes Canada livable. The evidence which CBC uses to convince frozen Canadians that they're actually burning up is this graph from the UK Met Office. The graph shows 5 different temperature data sets, all of which show that the Earth has been heating out of control since about the year 1900. These 5 graphs are all within a few percent of each other, so the data must be very precise. Let's take a closer look at these graphs. They all show the same thing. Temperatures were flat to down until just after the year 1900, and then they started skyrocketing. This consensus of very closely agreeing data sets means it must be true. In this video, we're going to look at whether or not these 5 different temperature graphs are either independent or credible. NASA temperature graphs actually don't even agree with themselves. The blue line is NASA's surface temperatures published in the year 2000. It showed about half a degree warming prior to the year 2000. The red line is their current graph, which now shows more than 1 degree warming prior to the year 2000. There's been a huge change in NASA's temperatures over the last 20 years. This has been accomplished by altering temperatures after the year 1880 and hiding warm temperatures prior to the year 1880. This graph shows changes which NASA has made to their surface temperature data set over the last 20 years. They've cooled the past about 0.4 degrees Celsius and warmed temperatures around the year 2000 by about 0.2 degrees Celsius. That's a pretty huge change. Now let's look at what the problem is with creating a global temperature data set. One of the biggest problems is that there's very little reliable historical data for most of the planet. For example, NOAA has no min-max temperature data for South America from the year 1900, very little from Africa, very little from Asia, and much of Russia and Siberia. This map shows stations where NOAA has daily temperature data prior to the year 1920. There's very little outside of the United States, Western Europe, and parts of Australia. And the vast majority of the high-quality data is from the United States. This is very important, as I'll show you later. How did these 5 different government agencies get graphs which are so similar and just vary by a small percent when the majority of the Earth's surface has no long-term historical data? That is not in the least bit credible. We've seen enough already to make it clear that these graphs are bogus, but I'm just getting started. This is a typical map which NOAA releases every month showing that the world is burning up. In September 2016, they showed record heat in Central Africa. But if we look at their underlying data, they didn't actually have any readings from Central Africa. It says, please note, gray areas represent missing data. There's no data there. How did they determine that it was record hot? This animation shows a close-up of what NOAA is doing. They're declaring record warmest in areas where there's absolutely no temperature data to work with. What these government agencies are doing isn't in the least bit credible. Now let's go back in time 45 years to the Ice Age scare. This graph was released by the National Center for Atmospheric Research, which is the government's climate lab. I ride my bicycle up there just about every day. They're located on a beautiful hillside up above Boulder, Colorado. The 1974 NCAR graph showed no warming from 1870 to 1970. There was a lot of warming from the 1890s to the 1940s, but after the 1940s, all of that warmth had been lost again. In this graph, I overlay the current NASA graph in red on top of the NCAR graph from 1974. You can see that NASA has erased the post-1940 cooling. And this graph was published in the November 1976 edition of National Geographic, and it showed the same thing. All the warming which had occurred prior to 1940 was lost by the 1970s. This graph was based on data from the USSR, from James Angel of NOAA, and from the U.S. National Academy of Sciences. And the same issue of National Geographic showed that Earth was much warmer 7,000 years ago when carbon dioxide levels were well below 300 parts per million. The Arctic is believed to have been ice-free at that time with very low levels of carbon dioxide. It's pretty clear that carbon dioxide does not control the climate. In 1978, the New York Times reported, International team of specialists finds no end in sight to 30-year cooling trend in Northern Hemisphere. And the team of specialists said, data from the Southern Hemisphere, particularly south of latitude 30 south, are so meager that reliable conclusions are not possible. In this ClimateGate email from 2009, Phil Jones from the University of East Anglia said, "For much of the southern hemisphere between 40 and 60 south, the temperature normals are mostly made up as there's very little ship data there." So there's very little land data available in the southern hemisphere, and there's also very little ocean data available in the southern hemisphere, and they're just making up the data which they've got. So this begs the question, how did all of these global temperature data sets come into such close agreement when there's so little data? And what happened to the cooling after 1940? It's almost gone. This ClimateGate email answers those questions. Tom Wigley from NCAR writing to Phil Jones at the University of East Anglia, copying Ben Santer at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratories. Wigley said, "If we could reduce the ocean blip by say 0.15 degrees Celsius, then this would be significant for the global mean, but we still have to explain the land blip. It would be good to remove at least part of the 1940s blip, but we're still left with why the blip." Climate scientists from different agencies colluded to come up with a common graph which removed the 1940s warmth, and they didn't even have an explanation for why they were going to do it. There's one word to explain why the graphs look so similar. It's called collusion. Now we're going to look at whether or not these graphs are credible compared to the historical record. In 1902, which was supposed to be one of the coldest years on record, glaciers were disappearing. In 1903, which was also supposed to be one of the coldest years on record, glaciers were rapidly retreating in Greenland. The Jacobshavn Glacier in Greenland had receded 8 miles since 1850 and had lost 20 to 30 feet in depth. In 1906, it was reported that the South Pole was warming up and that the Ross Ice Shelf had retreated some 30 miles. Yet the temperature graphs from these government agencies show 1906 as one of the coldest years on record and that Earth had been cooling. In 1907, people were reporting remarkable shrinkages in glaciers of the Alps. In 1910, scientists reported that glaciers were retreating all over the world, yet it was supposed to have been extremely cold and Earth was supposed to have been cooling. In 1917, it was reported, except over a small area, it is generally understood that glaciers of the world are retreating to the mountains. In 1922, it was reported, world's growing warmer. The ice fringes of both poles are retreating. European glaciers are everywhere receding. Ice in Antarctica had retreated 40 miles, yet it was supposed to have been really cold back then. In 1922, it was reported that the eastern Arctic was experiencing a radical change of climate conditions with unheard of high temperatures. Many old landmarks are so changed as to be unrecognizable. Where formerly great masses of ice were found, there are now often moraines, accumulations of earth and stones. At many points where glaciers formerly extended far into the sea, they have entirely disappeared. Also from 1922, strange things happening in the frozen Arctic. There was no ice around Spitsbergen that winter at all. This year there's lots of ice around Spitsbergen. Yet we're supposed to be about 1.2 degrees warmer now. That really doesn't make a lot of sense. 1923, North Pole melting. Many glaciers vanished. Yet according to these government graphs, it was very cold in 1923. In 1923, it was reported that Glacier National Park was melting at a very fast rate and was expected to be ice-free by 1948. Yet it was supposed to have been really cold. 1924, Colorado glaciers disappearing at a very rapid rate since 1919. 1927, glaciers in the Canadian Rockies were disappearing. 1930, glaciers in Switzerland were in full retreat. 1932, South Pole melting, Ross Ice Shelf rapidly retreating. 1932, hundreds of glaciers have disappeared from Yosemite National Park in California. The first living glacier, discovered by John Muir in 1871 in the Sierra Nevadas, now has ceased to exist. Yet the government graphs show 1932 cooler than the 1870s. 1935, an ice age passes. 1939, the glaciers of Greenland and Norway face the possibility of a catastrophic collapse. Yet the government graphs show 1939 as being very cold. Also in 1939, the Arctic regions around Spitsbergen were warming up at a rate of approximately 1 degree every 2 years. Winter temperatures had warmed nearly 16 degrees. Yet these government graphs show 1939 cooler than the late 1870s. 1940, Mount Rainier glaciers to disappear. 1947, Antarctica and Greenland rapidly melting, people living along seashores to drown. Dr. Allman added that temperatures in the Arctic have increased 10 degrees Fahrenheit since 1900, an enormous rise from the scientific standpoint. But I'm not seeing this huge rise in temperatures in the government graph. 1952, polar ice caps melting at an astonishing and unexplained rate and threatening to swamp seaports by raising ocean levels. The glaciers of Norway and Alaska are only half the size they were 50 years ago. Yet, according to these government scientists, temperatures then were a full degree Celsius cooler than they are now. 1958, the New York Times reports that the polar ice pack is 40% thinner and 12% less in area than it was a half century ago, and that within the lifetime of our children, the Arctic may be ice-free. But after 1958, things changed very suddenly. In 1961, there was a unanimous consensus that Earth was getting cooler. By 1963, it was reported that glaciers were going in Norway for the first time in 200 years. Yet these government graphs show temperatures warmer in 1963 than they were in 1939, when the glaciers were nearing catastrophic collapse. These graphs make absolutely no sense. By 1970, the United States and the Soviet Union were mounting large-scale investigations to determine why the Arctic climate was becoming more frigid, why parts of the Arctic sea ice had recently become ominously thicker, and whether the extent of that ice cover contributes to the onset of ice ages. 1973, Earth is cooling, return of the ice age is feared. Iceland blocked with ice for the first time since the 17th and 18th centuries. 1974, glaciers in Switzerland have begun advancing again. 1975, Science News, the Ice Age cometh. Glaciers plowing through downtown Manhattan. So the Arctic was rapidly melting down here, but up here we were supposed to be entering a new ice age. That doesn't make a lot of sense. Let's look now at a summary of the government graphs. 1902, glaciers disappearing. 1922, glaciers disappearing. 1939, Greenland glaciers nearing collapse. 1963, Norwegian glaciers growing. 1973, Iceland blocked with ice. So according to these government graphs, ice forms when it's warm and ice melts when it's cold. These government graphs make no sense and are not credible. Now let's do the same exercise with the 1974 NCAR graph. The NCAR graph shows ice melting when it's warm, and it shows ice forming when it's cold. This graph makes sense. Now let's look at the United States, where the vast majority of the world's high-quality temperature data is located. Before data tampering by government scientists, U.S. temperatures peaked in the 1930s, back when the Arctic was nearing a catastrophic collapse. Temperatures are much cooler now in the United States, with last year being one of the coolest years on record. This graph shows the average daily maximum temperature, and this one shows mean temperatures, which is the average of the maximum and the minimum. Once again, you can see that the warmest temperatures occurred prior to the post-1940s global cooling. This graph correlates well with the historical record of the behavior of ice. The U.S. temperature record, which is by far the best in the world, is problematic for climate scientists who are trying to push global warming. So NOAA alters the U.S. temperature data to turn a century-long cooling trend into a warming trend. There's nothing credible about government temperature graphs. They're propaganda, not science. In 1975, government scientists wanted to melt the Arctic ice cap by covering it with soot in order to stop global cooling and new ice age. It's pretty hard for me to take these people seriously. And one final thing, these government graphs are supposed to be independent. But 4 years ago, when Australian Senator Malcolm Roberts called out Gavin Schmidt at NASA for some obviously fraudulent graphs from Iceland, Schmidt said, "It's not my data. I get my data from NOAA." There's nothing independent or credible about these government graphs. They're the product of junk science and collusion. The people of Canada would be wise to ignore the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation and hold on to the fossil fuels which keep them alive. The Canadian Broadcasting Corporation is also trying to scare people with the Australia fires. But fire is the normal climate of Australia. This map of the 1939 fire showed that almost everything from Melbourne to Canberra burned up, a distance of 250 miles. 1939 was the same year which the glaciers of Greenland and Norway were facing a catastrophic collapse. Climate is cyclical, and the claims that we're having record heat now due to carbon dioxide in the atmosphere have no basis in either history or science. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science and propaganda for a long time.